Chapter 1. The Girl They Mistook for Softness. By the time the student transport Aurelian Dawn slipped free of the orbital docks above Vera Station, nobody aboard considered Mira's soul a threat worth remembering. That, later, would become the first line repeated in every inquiry, every survivor interview, every military after-action transcript. No one thought to watch the human girl until it was much too late. She was small for her age, narrow-shouldered, quiet in groups, and so careful in her movements that older species often mistook her self-control for fragility. She wore plain civilian gray instead of the bright cohort jackets the interspecies academy favored, kept her black hair tied back in a simple loop, and answered questions in a calm, almost apologetic voice that encouraged the galaxy's most common and fatal error regarding humans, assuming that composure meant harmlessness. To the other students aboard the transport, she was the scholarship girl from Earth's outer colonial belt, the one studying xenobiology and conflict ecology, the one who spent more time with specimen archives than with parties, the one who smiled politely when louder people tried to drag her into jokes, and then returned to whatever field report or anatomical chart had captured her attention. She looked, in every visible way, like a person built for observation rather than violence. The Academy liked students like that because they helped reassure the richer species that human integration into the Concord could be managed through education, protocol, and good corridor law. Mira was exactly the kind of human administrators preferred to point at during funding reviews. Disciplined, intelligent, socially quiet, from a family line without military scandal, and ambitious in the respectable direction of research rather than command. She had won admission after publishing a paper on predator adaptation patterns in high-stress biospheres, a paper so brilliant and so unsettling in its clarity that one examiner wrote privately that the girl either had a frightening future in systems analysis or the soul of a stalking animal who had learned to write. Fortunately for everyone's comfort at the time, the official comments praised only her insight and not the second possibility. At orientation, the station rector introduced her to the incoming class as evidence that humanity's strength is not merely physical but intellectual. That line made the room clap. Mira herself had simply dipped her head, murmured thanks, and sat back down with the same inward expression of someone already listening to sounds other people did not yet know mattered. The students around her came from 7 worlds and 12 different evolutionary traditions, and as always happens among the young, they built their judgments fast and lazily. Tall, golden-skinned SRE athletes assumed she would break under field conditions. 2 clipped-tongued Talari law scholars dismissed her as book-soft. A trio of avian Vesh pilots decided she was probably clever but too gentle for crisis response. Even her eventual friends did not see her clearly. Elwire of the Moss Worlds found her calming. Juno Marek found her dryly funny once she relaxed enough to show it. And Ralbrod, scaled, overconfident Ral from Keth Dominion called her the shy one, so often that it stopped sounding insulting and became simple identity. Mira never argued with any of it. That was the second mistake. Predators on Deathworlds learn early that being underestimated conserves energy. There is no need to bare teeth before the environment requires them. The Aurelian Dawn had been chartered to take the mixed cohort through the fractured systems beyond Vera for a month-long field practicum in post-war ecological recovery. It was supposed to be the sort of educational journey that turns distant suffering into manageable curriculum. Damaged moons, rewilding zones, old siege habitats under reconstruction. The usual places where Concord students were taught to look thoughtfully at tragedy and write technically precise essays about what politics had done to land and bodies. Mira had wanted the placement because she understood something many of her peers did not, that dead worlds do not stay dead in simple ways, and that the line between ecology and conflict is mostly a convenience used by bureaucrats who never step where something hungry still breathes beneath the ash. She had grown up on Halcyon Fringe, a hard human colony where survival required practical respect for storms, fungal bloom, ruptured machinery, and the occasional native crawler larger than a transport sled. The adults there taught children not bravery but calibration, which noises to investigate, which silences to distrust, how to move through dangerous spaces without waking all the danger at once. Mira had learned those lessons deeply enough that by adolescence she no longer thought of herself as brave in any ordinary sense. She simply understood that fear was useful only if it sharpened your attention faster than it slowed your hands. The first 3 days of the voyage were uneventful in exactly the way that makes later disaster feel predestined. There were lectures, rotations, squabbles over bunk privacy, and the usual social gravity of youth placing itself into temporary orbits. Mira spent most of her hours in Observation Lab 2 reviewing archived footage from predation events on reclaimed worlds, pausing often to take notes none of the others could interpret at a glance. Not statistics about attack frequency or body mass. Angle of movement. Delay before commitment. Threshold behavior in crowded conditions. Escape vector preference when cornered. One evening, Juno leaned over her shoulder, read a page of annotations, and said, half joking, "You do realize you take field notes like you're planning to fight the wildlife personally." Mira had looked up then with one of those small, almost smiles that never showed enough of what she truly thought. "Everything fights eventually," she said. "Most things just prefer not to until necessary." Then the distress beacon came. It flared into the transport's outer sensors as they crossed the dark lanes near Orphean Verge, a region still scarred from a resource war that had ended 10 years earlier and not really ended at all for the colonies abandoned in its administrative aftermath. The signal belonged to an old relief tender designated Mercy of Island, and its status string was ugly enough to silence even the loudest students at first read. Hull breach partial, life support degraded, unauthorized boarding probable, civilian complement unknown, medical emergency active. The captain of the Aurelian Dawn, a grizzled contracted civilian named Hal Saren, should by regulation have relayed the emergency to corridor patrol and held position at safe distance. But the nearest patrol was 9 hours out. The beacon was failing now, and there is a particular kind of moral pressure that locked ships create when you know people inside may not still be alive by the time procedure arrives. So Hal broke the cautious version of the law and altered course. The relief tender drifted in the dark like a wounded thing too tired to call for help a second time. Its outer lights were dead. One docking collar had been cut open from the outside in. Heat leakage bled from 3 hull seams. The first boarding team found bodies in the service Ring 2 med attendants, 1 cargo hand, and something else harder to name until the suit cams adjusted. Not ordinary raiders. Killer Scovpack. Genetically altered contract predators from the fringe black labs, used in some wars as tunnel clearers and close-quarters terror assets until treaties declared them unlawful, and everyone important kept buying them quietly through shell brokers anyway. The things were tall in a bent-jointed way, hairless, gray-black, with mouths built too wide and eyes that reflected light like wet stone. One lay dead with half its rib cage blown out. Another had been cut open from throat to lower gut by something sharp enough to make the wound look almost surgical. That detail bothered Mira the moment she saw the feed in the student common room. Not the dead predator itself, those things died often and deserved it, but the style of the kill. Fast, directed, intimate, not random defensive panic. Hal Saren locked the student compartments and ordered everyone to stay put while the crew assessed whether survivors remained. They did not stay put. Students almost never do once fear mixes with curiosity and the intoxicating belief that disasters happen around them rather than to them. Ral argued that as Kethborn he had field handling experience with hostile fauna and should assist. 2 Vesh students started patching into security feeds illegally. Juno paced. Lyr cried quietly without wanting to. Mira said very little, but she watched every update with the absolute stillness of an animal measuring weather. The boarding team reported signs of an active nest in the lower storage decks, possible survivors trapped in Medsection B, and at least 3 keelers still unaccounted for. The transport's captain announced emergency withdrawal from direct docking posture until patrol arrival. That was when the screaming started. Not over comms at first. Through the hull. A deep metallic hammering from somewhere in the Aurelian Dawn's underside, as something came aboard unnoticed during the retrieval of the first wounded. Then one security channel lit with gunfire and cut out. Then another with a short, strangled sound, and the distinct scraping rush of a keeler moving through a vent space too small for anything that large if the universe were decent. Chaos broke across the ship in waves. Doors sealed. Lights shifted red. Students shouted over one another. Somewhere aft, someone began praying in a language the translators did not even bother trying to smooth. Ral turned toward Mira then, maybe because she was the only one not screaming, and said with brittle contempt meant mostly to hold himself together, "Don't just stand there looking frightened." She looked at him, and perhaps if he had known humans better he might have noticed that she did not, in fact, look frightened in the usual way anymore. She looked awake. Chapter 2. The first body moved wrong. The keeler came through maintenance spine 2 minutes later and shattered the educational pretense of the voyage so completely that some of the surviving students would later struggle to remember there had ever been lectures aboard the ship at all. It hit the internal hatch fast enough to bend reinforced composite inward before the lock cycle had finished. 1 second there was only the alarm and the ugly chorus of frightened voices in the student common room. The next there was the sound every prey species in the universe recognizes no matter how civilized it becomes, the sound of something that has decided the barrier between you and it is temporary. The hatch burst. Metal screamed. A shape unfolded through the smoke in all the wrong angles nature produces when funded by wartime laboratories rather than evolution's slower cruelty. Gray-black skin, long forelimbs ending in hooked graspers, a head too narrow until the jaw opened and proved how much of it was mouth. 3 students froze. 1 ran. Another slipped and spilled ration fluid and began sobbing before she hit the deck. Mira moved. Not heroically. Not with a battle cry or cinematic certainty. She moved the way certain people do when crisis finally matches the internal map they have been building all their lives. One moment she stood between overturned benches with the red alarm light, painting her face flat and young and almost fragile. The next she was already reaching for the emergency galley cutter mounted beside the ration lockers and shouting one word that cut through the panic like impact. Down. The command worked because fear had softened everyone into obedience and because something in her voice made it sound older than the room, older than school hierarchy or social assumptions. Juno dropped instantly. LYR crumpled with hands overhead. Ral hesitated just long enough to prove later that pride remains one of the galaxy's most expensive reflexes. The keeler lunged at him first, sensing motion and challenge. Mira did not throw herself at the creature because only fools think courage means becoming meat faster. She crossed left, kicked the emergency suppression foam valve with enough force to rupture it, and filled the lane between the benches with white chemical blast just as the creature's forelimbs struck forward. Blinded for 1 second, one only, but enough. Mira was already under its reach, slashing upward not at the throat as frightened amateurs do, but at the inner hind joint where engineered tendon bundles had to remain flexible beneath armor tissue. The cutter bit. Black blood sprayed hot. The keeler screamed and collapsed sideways through 2 seat frames. Ral stared at her as if he had never seen a person before. The thing was not dead. That mattered. Deathworld predators do not assume one wound ends an engagement unless the skull or spine has told them so directly. Mira knew that in the same muscle-deep way she knew how to brace for decompression and how many breaths a panic attack steals before reason can reassert itself. She grabbed Ral by the front of his tunic, yanked him bodily clear of the thrashing tail, and shoved him toward the others. "Move," she snapped. "If it gets vertical again, go for the eyes or joints, not the ribs." Students are not soldiers. Most of them obeyed because terror finally found instruction. A few because they could not process the fact that the quiet human girl from Lab 2 was now giving kill guidance over the shrieking of a biotech war predator as if she had been born waiting for the opportunity. Juno recovered first. She seized a fire suppressant canister and smashed it against the creature's head as it convulsed upright. Someone else stabbed with a snap chair strut. Mira took the opening, came down hard across the back of the neck, and drove the galley cutter through the thinner seam beneath the skull plate until the body kicked once and stopped. Silence hit the room in a wet, ugly wave. No one spoke. Mira stood over the corpse, breathing too steadily for the scene around her, one hand coated in black blood up to the wrist, the emergency cutter hanging low in her grip. For a heartbeat, she looked less like a student than something far older and less social that had put on student shape until required otherwise. Then she blinked, swallowed once, and seemed to remember the others were there. "Check the doors," she said, voice rough now, almost human again. If it came through that spine, there may be more. That was the second shock. Not that she had killed it. That after killing it, she had not broken. The room, on the other hand, had. Lyr was crying openly. One of the Vesh students had vomited in the corner. Raoul touched his own chest, as if confirming it remained closed, and then looked at Mira with a confusion deeper than gratitude. You, he started, then failed language completely. She wiped the cutter once on the dead thing's hide and gave him a look that held no triumph. Yes, she said. Now help me barricade. The next half hour rewrote every social relationship aboard the Aurelian Dawn. News of the kill spread through internal channels before the body had cooled. Human student neutralized Keeler in Common Room 3. Repeat, threat down, threat down. The crew, pinned in 3 separate sectors and trying not to lose the entire vessel, seized on any usable center of stability. Hell-Saren rerouted surviving students toward Myra's compartment cluster because it was one of the few places not yet compromised. 2 security officers reached them on fallback retreat and stared at the carcass lying twisted across the benches with the same expression many species eventually were the first time they witness human violence freed from civility constraints. Not simple fear, but conceptual discomfort, as if some category had broken and spilled teeth into the room. The surviving officer, a scarred Nerith woman named Duva, looked from the Keeler to Mira and asked the sort of question people ask when they hope the answer will restore ordinary scale. Have you fought these things before? Mira shook her head. Duva frowned. Then how did you know where to cut? Myra's gaze flicked once toward the torn hind leg joint, then back to the officer. Because they're predators built by intelligent idiots, she said. Everything built to spring has to bend somewhere. No one in the room forgot that sentence. They began moving under her guidance not because she outranked anyone, but because she had become the local fact of survival. Barricades went up. Vent routes were mapped. Injured were triaged. Pressure doors manually locked. Mira took one glance at the ship schematic Duva projected from her wrist slate and immediately identified 3 likely approaches the Keeler would prefer: shadowed service lanes with converging scent corridors and thin enough lighting to let them control the first visual. They don't want the easy crowd, she said. They want clusters. Noise, panic, bodies trapped together. That's how the labs tuned them. Group fracture first. Feed after. Even Duva, who had served 2 corridor suppression campaigns and buried more things than a student should have needed to explain to her, listened without interruption. Raoul found his voice only after they had moved the youngest students into the sealed galley annex. You knew, he said quietly, standing too close while she washed black blood from her hands in a ration basin. Not about today, but this. You knew how to become that. She looked at the water rather than at him. When she answered, the words came with an old weariness that did not belong in someone her age. On Halcyon Fringe, she said, we learn early that being gentle and being harmless are not related. Then she finally met his eyes. The galaxy keeps making the mistake of thinking humans only have one setting. That's because most of you meet us in classrooms and council chambers. He flinched at the most of you, not because it was cruel, but because it was deserved. Outside the barricade, something big moved through the ventilation shafts. The sound traveled along the metal like a fingernail dragged down the spine of the ship. Someone whimpered. Mira closed the water valve, picked up the cutter again, and in that instant every rumor old military species had ever traded about humans became briefly visible to the civilians in the room. Not super soldiers. Not monsters. Worse, a species that looked ordinary until violence became necessary, and then adapted faster than fear expected. The second Keeler came at the ceiling. It dropped through an access grate over the sleeping racks, and took one of the security officers before the room had fully registered motion. Duva's rifle cracked twice, too late to save him, and just in time to turn the predator's attention toward her. Mira did not shout this time. She was past shouting. She went up the rack wall itself, boots finding holds in seams and handrails, and launched from the upper frame onto the creature's back with a speed that no one aboard would later describe correctly, because no one watching really believed a body could move like that under panic and gravity. The Keeler bucked. Her first strike missed the eye and carved across the cranial ridge. The second hit home. Duva fired again at near-contact range and lost half an ear to the return snap of the beast's jaws. Raoul, mad from terror or loyalty or the contagious logic of survival, rammed a shock baton into the creature's flank. It convulsed just long enough for Mira to wrench the blade sideways and tear down through the orbital cavity into the brainstem. When it was over, she knelt over the corpse, breathing hard, one hand braced on the deck, dark human hair fallen loose around a face no one aboard could ever fully return to its earlier harmlessness. She had looked innocent. Now every person in that room understood that innocence had never been the correct word. Chapter 3. The Predator woke all the way. After the second kill, the ship stopped being an educational transport in any meaningful psychological sense and became what desperate vessels in contested space always become: a moving habitat of competing fears trying not to die faster than command can assign explanation. The students no longer clustered by prior friendships or species comfort. They clustered by whoever seemed likely to recognize danger earliest. And at the center of that gravity now stood Mira's soul, with her blood-wet cutter, torn sleeve, and the unnerving calm of someone whose body had remembered an older instruction set than anyone else aboard knew existed. That frightened some of them almost as much as the killer. There is a particular discomfort civilized species feel when confronted with a person who has crossed visibly from one of us into one of the things that survives where us stops working. It is not simple revulsion. It is envy mixed with fear, mixed with the dawning suspicion that, under enough pressure, the categories holding society together may have been thinner than advertised. Captain Hal Saren finally broke protocol and opened a command link directly into the barricaded student sector. His face appeared on the wall screen, slick with engine room sweat and emergency light shadows. One cheek burned from an earlier pressure blowout. "Status?" he demanded. Duva, one ear sealed in med foam and rifle braced across her chest, answered first. 2 Keeler neutralized in common 3 cluster. 14 student survivors. "We're holding." Hal's eyes shifted past her and found Mira. Even through the distortion and static of the damage link, his expression changed. He had probably boarded the vessel with nothing but a captain's utilitarian impression of a quiet scholarship passenger. Now there she was in the center of a room that looked as if a war had accidentally happened inside it. "You're Mercer's daughter," he said abruptly. Mira froze just enough for those who knew how to see it. The others looked between them in confusion. Duva frowned. "Who?" Hal swallowed once, as if realizing too late that the room had just become more complicated. "Jonah Mercer," he said. "Halcyon Fringe Militia Recovery. Siege of Tharsis Array. They used to call him Dash." "Don't," Mira said. But Hal had already understood something from the bodies on the floor, the positioning of the barricade, and the way the students were orienting toward her. "Predator unit," he finished quietly. Silence rippled out harder than either Keeler death. Ral stared at her. "Your father was Special Forces?" Mira looked at him with a face so exhausted for 1 second that it aged her years beyond the Academy roster. "No," she said. "He was a farmer after the war." Then, more harshly, "Before that, he was what the frontier needed." Her hand tightened around the cutter. "And he spent the rest of his life hoping I would never need the same lessons." That explained too much and not enough. The military species aboard heard frontier recovery and filled in the rest themselves. Human special recovery units had left ugly footprints through half the outer systems during the corridor wars, fast insertions, impossible civilian extractions, close quarters doctrine built around ending predatory threats before ordinary command could even define the local situation properly. Most of the galaxy thought of such units as elite military outliers. But anyone from the hard human colonies knew the more dangerous truth. Skills learned in those units had a way of bleeding home into family training, caution rituals, and survival instincts passed quietly to children under the excuse of practical education. If Mira was Jonah Mercer's daughter, then the Deathworld predator everyone was now seeing might not be some hidden aberration. It might be inheritance. The third Keeler did not wait for the identity crisis to settle. It came through the floor. The beast punched up from a maintenance trench beneath the sealed galley annex where the youngest students had been hidden, proving what Mira had warned from the start. Engineered predators do not test the obvious point twice if they've already read your panic pattern. They adapt. The grate exploded upward. 2 children screamed. The Keeler hit one of the support posts and spun straight toward the annex door. Mira was already moving before the first body in the room chose direction. She threw the cutter not at the creature, but at the release valve over the galley's emergency boil tank. The blade shattered the latch. Superheated foam burst down in a blinding stream directly over the thing's head and shoulders. It roared, staggered, and came half sideways into the room. Duva opened fire. So did Hell remotely by slaving the corridor turret through a local override. Rounds chewed the deck, the beast the wall. Still it moved. That was when Mira did something the survivors would never stop describing with the same stunned disbelief. She went for its mouth. Not because she was feral or fearless. Because she had measured the room and understood that the next 3 seconds were the difference between one dead predator and several dead children. She grabbed the fallen baton from Raoul's stunned hand, drove straight through the steam, jammed the weapon lengthwise between the beast's lower jaws as it snapped, and used the stuck bite reflex to lever its head broadside long enough for Duva's burst to punch clean through the softer seam at the skull base. The keeler collapsed half on top of her. The room held one impossible image for a second. The quiet human girl pinned beneath the corpse of a war-bred predator, breathing in harsh wet gasps. One hand still locked around the shock baton jammed between its teeth. Then everyone moved at once. They hauled the body off, checked her limbs, found blood, and could not immediately tell whose. Mira shoved away helping hands twice before allowing Ilian, the Vesh medic student, to inspect the long rip across her side where one claw had caught her. "You need stitches," he said, voice shaking. "Later," she answered. How many left? Nobody had the certainty to answer. That was the worst part. Not knowing. The captain's scans were patchy. The relief tender's original manifest listed 7 Keeler containment units. 3 were now dead. One might have gone out an airlock during the first boarding collapse. That left too many possibilities and too few walls. The survivors' feelings toward Mira shifted again after that. Not into simple admiration. Real survival rarely produces such clean emotional outcomes. Some looked at her with awe, yes, because she had repeatedly done what the trained security could not do quickly enough. But others looked with a subtler fear, one less about gratitude than about proximity. She had crossed into the place where violence stopped being hypothetical and become frighteningly effective in it. She knew where to cut, when to bait, how to move toward a thing everyone else's body screamed to flee. Even when she went still afterward, hunched over while Ilian sealed the side wound and Juno held a light for him, there was a residual charge to her, as if some internal system had powered fully on and not yet found the command to sleep again. LYR, who had liked her from the beginning in the gentle, ordinary way, sat beside her afterward and asked the question the others were too uncomfortable to ask directly. "Are you all right?" Mira let out one bitter little breath that might have been a laugh if it had wanted mercy. "No," she said, "but I'm useful." LYR touched the back of her hand once. "That's not the same thing." For the first time since the fighting began, Myra's face almost broke. That, more than anything, revealed the cost of what had woken inside her. The Deathworld predator was real, yes. The galaxy's old military phrase for humans existed for reasons. But what everyone watching too often forgot was that becoming the thing that survives also means becoming the thing that remembers exactly how it survived. Mira had not turned into a monster. She had turned into what the situation required, and some hidden part of her hated how naturally the shape fit. The final Keeler found them in the engine's spine. Of course it did. Predators go to the heart. By then Hell had organized the survivors into 3 groups. Engineers trying to keep propulsion stable enough for a distress burn, med staff and students under Duva's protection, and Mira because no category in civilized command language was broad enough to name, the person we keep near the children because she notices the thing before the thing happens. The last Keeler had learned from the others. It did not charge. It stalked. It used the ship noise and smoke and shattered light. It killed one engineer silently, then doubled back through heat vents to make the security team overcommit to the wrong corridor. Mira caught the pattern by scent first burnt protein, wet metal, the musk-sharp edge of adrenaline not human and then by absence. No scraping. No roar. Too quiet. She stopped in the middle of the engine gangway and said, "It's waiting for us to bunch." Hell's voice crackled over calm. "Can you confirm?" "No," she said. "But if I'm right and you ignore me, it takes the med group at the turn." Again that ugly choice. Trust the frightening human student or the ordinary logic everyone preferred. Hell chose her. Good captain. Bad future for his nerves. They spread out. Changed pace. Killed the lights entirely for 3 seconds on Myra's order. The Keeler moved exactly then, lunging from the overhead cable racks toward what it thought was the densest body cluster. There was no dense cluster anymore. Only traps. Duva's rifle burst. Hell's remote vented steam. Mira came in from the blind side and drove a sharpened engineering spike up through the underjaw where no armor tissue had formed thick enough. The Predator crashed, spasmed, and was finally still. Afterward, when the patrol ships arrived at last and found the Aurelian Dawn limping, bloodied, and somehow still alive, the boarding Marines entered expecting civilians in need of extraction. What they found instead was a corridor lined with dead Keeler, stunned students. One captain half delirious with relief, one security officer holding the line by stubborn hatred alone, and at the center of it all a slight human girl sitting on the deck against the engine bulkhead while a Vesh medic stitched her side. Her hands were washed now, but not clean. Her eyes lifted to the Marines with a flat, tired awareness older than the rest of her. One of the troopers, seeing the bodies, asked in honest confusion, who neutralized them? No one answered immediately. Then Rao, who had spent the entire voyage treating Mira as if she were one soft social category among many, looked at the dead Predators and then at her and said, voice hollow with revelation. She did. Chapter 4. What the Galaxy Feared About Humans. The official report on the Aurelian Dawn incident ran 912 pages, which is how institutions try to bury awe beneath paper when awe becomes politically inconvenient. It cataloged hull damage, security failures, biotech violations, delayed corridor response, student trauma ratios, casualty counts, and the chain of custody linking the unlawful Keeler deployment back to a subcontractor nobody important would publicly admit employing. Buried in Appendix 17, under language so dry it practically flaked, was the sentence that went on to change Academy policy in 3 sectors and wake old military fears across 6 more. Civilian human passenger Mirasol demonstrated combat adaptation and close threat neutralization capability consistent with frontier special recovery conditioning despite no formal active service record. That wording should have reassured the species that still preferred humanity to fit inside understandable boxes. Instead, it did the opposite. Because the report quietly admitted what many old powers had long suspected and hoped had become outdated. You did not always need a formal human special forces unit to create a special forces problem. Sometimes all you needed was one human raised close enough to hardship, taught the right lessons by the wrong century, and placed in a room where predation became non-optional. The media, naturally, simplified everything and made it worse. She looked innocent. Until the Deathworld predator inside her woke up, ran one notorious headline on a Varen network that profited equally from fear and admiration. Another called her the quiet human who killed the monsters barehanded, which was inaccurate but emotionally tidy. Mira hated all of it. She hated the footage loops, the panel discussions, the military analysts speaking in fascinated tones about latent human threat expression, and most of all the way people began looking at her in the weeks after rescue as if she had ceased to be a student and become a specimen proving everyone's old best and worst assumptions simultaneously. Governments wanted statements. Militaries wanted interviews. Trauma specialists wanted to help in the gentle way that sometimes feels like disassembly. The Academy wanted to control the narrative so it did not become a diplomatic incident with teeth. Mira wanted, more than anything, to sleep without hearing the sound of the second Keeler's spine folding under impact. The universe, with its usual concern for human desires, did not pause. Yet the deeper shock did not come from civilians. It came from the species who had spent decades studying humans professionally and had begun, very foolishly, to think that peace had softened them into predictability. The old intelligence services already knew the formal human recovery units were bad enough. They had files, casualty maps, and doctrinal studies proving what happened when Terran states decided a trapped population counted as theirs. But the Aurelian Dawn case introduced a more troubling possibility into every serious war planner's calculations, that human violence under pressure was not always confined to specialized state actors. It could emerge diffusely, familially, culturally, inherited through frontier worlds, hard colonies, old militia traditions, and domestic survival training. The predator, in other words, might not be a hidden elite cadre waiting in the dark. It might be sitting quietly in a civilian lecture hall, taking notes, until the room gave it a reason to wake. Mira herself understood this better than the analysts did, and it frightened her more honestly than their theories ever could. She spent the months after recovery in compulsory counseling, debrief rooms, and one miserable legal inquiry where a transport ethics board tried to decide whether the students had been endangered more by the killer or by an unregulated human escalation response. Duva nearly started a second incident over that phrasing. Ral, unexpectedly, became Myra's loudest defender in public, perhaps because surviving thanks to someone you underestimated has a way of rearranging your priorities. Lyr remained gentler and therefore, in some ways, braver. She sat with Mira through the bad nights and never once used words like monster, weapon, or miracle. You did what was needed, she said once. Mira, staring at the station rain through reinforced glass, answered, "That's exactly what I'm scared of." Because the truth she could not explain cleanly to any board or press office was this. Under the pressure of real predation, she had not become someone else. She had become more fully, more dangerously herself. The lessons had fit. The motion had felt natural. The predator had not been a stranger inside her. It had been an inheritance waiting for context. When she finally returned to the academy, the ship of her life had shifted orbit permanently. Students still watched her, some with admiration, some with fear, some with the strained curiosity species reserved for things they want close enough to study and far enough not to trigger. Ral apologized in a way too awkward to be elegant, and therefore worth more than elegance. "I thought shy meant weak," he said. Mira gave him a tired look. "Most predators prefer quiet until commitment." He winced. "Yes, I've learned that in a deeply personal way." They became, improbably, friends. Juno treated her much the same as before, which might have been the greatest kindness. Lyr continued to ask the only useful question after bad dreams. "Not are you all right, but what do you need right now?" The academy assigned Mira a discreet security shadow she mostly pretended not to notice. She returned to her studies because that, too, was part of the human contradiction the galaxy found so difficult to metabolize. A person could tear a biotech predator open in an engine corridor and still, a week later, want to finish her ecological recovery paper before the deadline. The legend grew anyway. Military students on other worlds began using her case in tactical debates. Fringe settlements started telling their children some version of the story as warning and reassurance together. Do not underestimate the quiet human girl. Do not assume softness means safety. Do not corner what can learn you back. The phrase Deathworld predator attached itself to her in 100 ugly ways, many of them wrong. Because the galaxy prefers simple myth, and simple myth is easier than admitting the actual lesson. The actual lesson was never that humans are secretly all monsters. It was worse. It was that humans contain extraordinary capacity for both tenderness and violence, and under enough threat, those two things do not always oppose one another. Sometimes the tenderness is exactly why the violence becomes so final. Years later, when Mirasol lectured at the reopened Academy of Interspecies Survival Studies, she began one famous session with a line the students copied for decades afterward because it clarified the entire terrifying thing better than any state memo or military brief. She stood under soft hall light in a plain gray instructor coat, one hand resting on the hollow projected anatomy of a Keeler war beast, and said, "You are taught to fear what looks dangerous. That is the first mistake. Real predators often survive by looking harmless until the environment gives them permission not to." A student from the inner rings, nervous and brave enough to ask, raised a hand. "Instructor Sol, do you mean the Keeler, or humans?" Mira looked at the class for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." And that was why the galaxy prayed never to face them. Not merely because humans had ships, marines, or special recovery laws. Not even because their formal special forces were terrifying in the old familiar military way. No. The prayer existed because after enough incidents like the Aurelian Dawn, the rest of civilized space had to confront a possibility more unsettling than elite violence. That what made humans so dangerous was not just what they trained for, but what lived quietly in them all the time, disciplined, educated, smiling politely in lecture halls, carrying books and bioscanners and gentle voices until the wrong thing came through the hatch and the death world inside them finally woke up.